I want to take a minute to talk to you about using secondary sources well in your literary analysis research essays. So one thing that we don't want to use a secondary source for is just summarizing the plot. When you are reading a secondary source, they will use some plot summary to set up the context for the argument being made by the writer of that secondary source. Like you, the secondary source author is writing about a primary source, a poem, a short story, a play, a novel. And you don't need to use a lot of plot summary yourself, nor do you need to use what is plot summary in the secondary source as the thing that you're quoting. So that would be considered general information that you would understand just from having read the work of literature once or twice. So anything like that you would just understand from having read the text, you don't need to quote from another source. So use college level sources. Make sure that you're not using the study guide type sources that are available online. I realize that there are some that are really good study guides, but that is at a high school level, and you are looking for college level sources to interact with. And that's your goal when writing using secondary sources. You're basically giving a written conversation between you and a scholar, somebody who has been studying this work of literature for a long time, long enough to have a published research article about it, to have published some unique ideas. So you're really looking for their unique perspective on the novel, short story, play, or poem that you are researching. Now, sometimes it can feel difficult to find those scholarly sources. Please use your college library. The librarians have magical powers, and they really can find just about anything you're looking for and are always so good and so happy to help. So don't feel like you're stuck doing it all on your own if you've never done research before for a literary analysis. Make sure that you get the help that you need from a librarian. The librarians will be able to access even more sources than your instructors can. They just know how to do research. That's why they love being librarians. So another thing you want to be careful of when you are writing your literary analysis essays is that you're not just stating simple facts unless you are just setting up context for the assertion. So you want to make an assertion in each paragraph that will support the overall thesis. That's sort of the biggest assertion of your whole essay. If you have a one-paragraph assignment, your main idea sentence is that assertion, and you are proving it using sources and your own commentary and interaction with those sources within the paragraph. So I just want you to notice the difference. A fact is Puff the Magic Dragon is magical. You cannot argue that. So the assertion statement is arguable. So you want to make arguable assertions. Jackie conjures Puff the Magic Dragon to help him feel confident enough to make the transition from boyhood to adolescence, a seemingly magical change in a person's life. So you want to make sure that you choose ideas to quote from the secondary source. And those should be ideas that you either argue for or against. And you can use evidence from the primary source to back up your support of the secondary source's argument or your refutation or argument against the secondary source's argument. But the goal is to have an intellectual debate with other scholars who have studied this text. So let's look at these two quotations from the same article, and just a caveat here. The article is about a sermon by John Winthrop called A City Upon a Hill that you may study in early American literature. But the article is also called A City Upon a Hill, and Elizabeth Winthrop is the author. She's a contemporary researcher. So that little caveat is important just because the authors' names are so similar and the title here is similar too. So we have in her article, A City Upon a Hill, Elizabeth Winthrop writes, Winthrop continues to examine the role of the individual in relation to the community, particularly with regard to wealth and its stewardship. All right, another quotation I have pulled from that secondary source is, in her article, A City Upon a Hill, Elizabeth Winthrop argues that John Winthrop explicitly acknowledged something that later leaders have ignored in their echoing words, the possibility of failure on the world's stage. So the second quotation has the word argues to introduce it, so that kind of gives you a hint that I have found something that the writer of the secondary source, Elizabeth Winthrop, has written that makes her own assertion. She's asserting that other people have ignored the possibility of the failure of the city upon a hill. So that would be an arguable thing that I could address in a paragraph where I can use that quotation and information from the primary source to make a point about the validity or invalidity of her statement. So here is a draft of a paragraph of how you might continue that discussion with the scholar using the primary source to back up your position. So I have the main idea statement to begin, and then I will introduce the texts and sprinkle in the different sources, the primary source and the secondary source, to build the argument and show how I'm having a conversation using the primary source as my support for interacting with Elizabeth Winthrop's article about the same topic, the same primary source. Americans sometimes struggle with the seemingly paradoxical values of individuality and community. So, main idea sentence. However, in John Winthrop's famous sermon, A Model of Christian Charity, he makes it clear that the ideal community celebrates individuality and community by equating the community to a body with many specialized or individualized parts. Without nurturing the individual, the community will fail. The purpose of Winthrop's sermon is to warn the 700 individuals sailing to America with him that they have an opportunity to show the world how exceptional they are when the individuals are nurtured and cared for within the collective. It's rather ironic, then, that Elizabeth Winthrop argues in her article, A City Upon a Hill, John Winthrop explicitly acknowledged something that later leaders have ignored in their echoing words, the possibility of failure on the world's stage. So my first source, I've actually introduced the topic, the primary source first, so there's context there for the argument. And then the first thing I've quoted is from Elizabeth Winthrop's A City Upon a Hill, and I misspoke earlier. A Model of Christian Charity is actually John Winthrop's work, which is always known as the City Upon a Hill sermon. That's the refrain that you will remember. So then after I quote something, I need to comment on it. I need to interact, engage with that idea in my own words, give my own ideas, react to that. Too often, there seems to be more selfishness concerning individual freedoms over the health and prosperity of the entire community. One might argue, therefore, that America has not achieved the exceptional status to which the initial City Upon a Hill aspired, especially concerning the role of the individual in relation to the community, particularly with regard to wealth and its stewardship. So that is a fact that I used, you'll remember from the last slide. That's just a fact that I found interesting. And that was one of Elizabeth Winthrop's contextual pieces of information, and I managed to work that in here too. So it's not that you can't use some of that information, but you don't want to use something that just summarizes the text. All right, so it should still be something that gives the reader more information about the idea that this one researcher has had and has written about. You will use your own ideas and the primary source to support your own ideas as you interact between the scholar's ideas and your ideas. And we'll see that in a moment. Given the social and economic disparities that still plague the nation, one might easily argue that the city upon a hill has failed in God's work described in A Model of Christian Charity, in which John Winthrop declares God counts himself more honored in dispensing his gifts to man by man than if he did it in his own immediate hands. So that is from the primary source, and the reader will know that because I introduce by title and author, which is why I don't have the author down here. So if I had not introduced by title and author, I would need to put the author's actually first and last name, because as you see here, Winthrop and Elizabeth is over here. When I have authors that have the same last name, I need to distinguish them by making sure that's clear in the parenthetical citation or in the introduction to the quotation. So then if I've just quoted from the primary source, I need to explain why that helps support my point. I don't need to just assume that the reader will understand it the way I do. I need to make sure the reader understands how that supports my point. So don't just drop a quote in and then mic drop and walk away and don't address it. Don't explain it to your reader. You have to explain everything. Never assume that it's implied or that the reader will understand your support from the primary source the way you do. You have to write about it, explain it. So that's what I do here. Clearly, John Winthrop sees living in community as part of God's plan to allow people to practice the values of mercy, justice, forgiveness, generosity, and love. Although it may seem paradoxical to view both individualism and community, John Winthrop value both individualism and community. John Winthrop reminds the early Americans of the metaphor of the body and the value each part of the body plays in the success of the whole. This is what will make America exceptional and worthy of being a city upon a hill. So making sure that you interact with, engage with the ideas of the author of the secondary source is super important. If your secondary source has no ideas that you can engage with because they're making no original claims or arguments about the work, you need to find a different source. You haven't found the level of scholarly research that you need to find. So let your librarians help you. Keep digging. If you don't find one at first, that is not unusual. Usually to find one good source, you have to read 3 or 4. And you can skim several before you find 3 or 4 worth reading, and then decide on one of those to use out of the 3 or 4. So it takes time, it takes a lot of work, it takes patience, and it just takes a lot of sticking to it and reading and learning and finding something that not only that is arguable in the secondary sources work, but something that catches your attention that you feel like you can respond to, backing up your points with the primary source. All right, happy researching. Good luck.